So welcome to your first introduction into what these mobile phones can do, and specifically iPhones. As I said before in the intro, these are amazing machines. The first thing that we're going to be covering is the actual settings within your camera app. And I'm going to be explaining what they are and how they can really help you and enhance your photography and your filming. So the first thing I want you to do is take your finger and just drag down until you get the menu system up. Then in the menu system, you're going to type in camera. Now what you're going to do is you're going to scroll down and until you see the little cog wheel. So the cog wheels will be the settings of your camera. So we're just going to click into that. Once we're in there, you're going to see a whole bunch of settings in there. Now we're just going to go through the ones that you really need to be focusing on more than anything. There's a lot of stuff in there that you won't need, but there's stuff in there that will really be fundamental to making your work flow, your editing flow a lot quicker, simpler and easier. So the first thing we're going to look at the very top of the page there on my 14 Pro is record video. Now in record video, if we open that up, you'll see loads of different HD, 4K, frames per second, everything. So I want you just to put the phone down for 1 minute and I'm just going to talk you through a few bits to do with frame rate and to do with image size. Because there's a lot of myth around that you need to be shooting in the highest possible quality you can. It's rubbish. And I'll tell you why that's rubbish. So if you think about your shooting in the highest possible quality 24/7, think of how much storage that's going to take up on your phone for starters. Like ridiculous amounts. You would need some sort of external storage to be able to cope with all that stuff on your phone, or ridiculous amounts of memory on your phone. It's just not needed. And think about where these videos are going to be played. They're played on your phone, on social platforms, on YouTube, sitting on your website. It's a known fact that most people, when they're looking at anything, won't be looking on a big screen. They will be on an iPad or some sort of iPhone or mobile phone somewhere. That in mind, we don't need to be shooting in 4K resolution. So let me explain 4K resolution for you. So 1080 HD is a large enough quality on its own to be shooting in. 4K is about 3 times the size as what HD is. I'm just going to show you quickly on this diagram of what I mean by that. It's a ludicrous amount. So we're not shooting for cinema, we're shooting for mobile phones. So with that in mind, we'll delve back into the settings and you can see all the different frame rates that we have here. I have selected 1080 high definition at 60 frames per second. Now 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second are obviously two different things. So think of it as a flick book. So there's 30 pages in a flick book that we're flicking through. As we flick through and the little man's running in the corner, do you remember them ones that we used to get? The little man's running in the corner. It's going to be nice, but it's not going to be really flowy, is it? It's going to be a little bit juttery and a bit shuttery. So that's at 30 frames per second. If we double the pages in the book and make it 60 pages, so 60 frames per second, that will be a lot different and a lot smoother because there's more pages for us to flick through. So the movements will be smaller of the little matchstick man and it will run a lot smoother. So the same thing as same with frame rate really. So 60 frames per second is a lot of frames that we're recording per second. Now the reason we do that will become apparent later when we do the editing, because when we want to slow stuff down, we've got more options with 60 frames per second than what we would have with 30. So it'd be a smoother slow motion than what it is if it was 30 frames per second. I hope I haven't completely lost you with that, but it is quite simple when you start thinking about how much you're recording per second. We're ticked at 1080 at 60 frames per second. So let's come back out of that, back to the main menu. Now slow motion, this is all about frames per second. I personally don't use it. it's very difficult to override the flicking of the lights. So I tend to not use it, if I'm honest. But if you do want to use it, the settings that are in there at the moment work actually quite good. So at 120 frames per second, you'll get a nice, smooth, slowy sort of slow motion. I'll do a clip of something that I've done with some flowers here. So at 240 frames per second, go back to our flick book of how many pages that would be and how much frames per second that we are recording. That's a lot. So that's going to be super slow motion. So it's nice for, you know, when you're doing pouring shots, or, you know, if something's really sparking off or something like that and you really want to show that slow motion. A dog coming out of the water and shaking its coat. That would look nice in slow motion, and in broad daylight, really, really nice. So the settings that I use for that is just 120 frames per second, just because I don't use it that often. Now, some of you might have this setting and some of you won't, but the ones that do, we're going to go into cinematic. Now, what you have for cinematic is exactly the same as what you had in just our video settings. So you've got 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second at 4K, and 4K 30 frames per second. Now I have mine at 1080, 30 frames per second. Now Hollywood movies are shot at 24 frames per second. Now that tells you how many frames per second you really need to be shooting at. Okay, now if we come out of there and we carry on moving down our menu system, we have formats. So within our formats, we just want to tick high efficiency. We go down to Pro RAW and Resolution Control. You just want to flick that on. Pro Default. So this is the size of your images. So these phones, believe it or not, you can print a picture up to A1, which is pretty big, to be honest. Probably bigger than what most people would be using. That's like big poster size. I like to shoot that as high quality as possible, because some of the stuff that we do with these phones actually go off to print. So for brochures or for posters or anything really. So the higher the quality of the picture does make a lot more sense than what it does with the footage. And as we carry on down, as we come out of all that and we carry on down, record stereo sound. Absolutely. Everything should be in stereo. Otherwise, if you've got someone that just wears one earbud, they're not going to hear what's going on in the other one. So it just be coming out of one. That's mono. So we want to be in stereo. Both. Use volume up for burst. This means you can just take photos with your volume up button. Scanning the QR codes and show detected text. Now this is within the camera app. So QR codes, if you hold your camera up to a QR code, you can get a website that comes up. So a lot of people use it for their menus and other bits and pieces. Show detected text. You can do if you take a picture of something that's got a phone number on it, you can actually tap and hold on the phone number and it will So we're looking at grid, level, mirror front camera and view outside the frame. So grid is a must because we're going to be working on a rule of thirds. So composition is all about rule of thirds. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into that later. But just for the moment, you need to have that ticked. Level pretty much says what it is. There's a little bar that comes up in the middle just to show that your phone is level. Mirror the front camera. We don't need that on at all. And view outside the frame, we don't need. So viewing outside the frame basically means when you open up your camera app, you will see everything on the front of that screen of your mobile phone. You don't need to see that. You can cut all that out and just literally what you're looking at is what you're going to be taking the picture of, which is what you want to be doing really. Then we come down, photographic styles. I always leave that as standard. The reason I leave that as standard is because everyone has their own style. You will develop your own style. You don't need to be putting filters on stuff. And I'll tell you now, if you're doing products, the worst thing you want to do is stick a filter over it. You just want it to be as natural as possible. Lens correction and macro control. Now, lens correction, I tend to turn that off because I like to do that myself in editing. And macro control, turn that off because it's basically an automatic way of your camera knowing if you're too close to something or too far away from something. And it actually gets quite confusing sometimes. So I would override that and just come away from that. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. Listen, them settings are not set in stone. As you're going along, you might want to tweak a few settings. You might prefer something else. They're just the settings that I use. And that's just the way that I find it easier to use. So if you want to move along a bit and start tweaking your own settings, that's entirely up to you. Massive disclaimer here. When it comes to anything creative, there's no right or wrong. It's down to you, the creator, to make these things look as good as possible. Anyway, I hope that's been not too much of a minefield for you. So come on, let's jump into the next section.